Test. Can everybody hear me?
Anytime.
Great. All right. I'm Sue Freedom, Executive Director of Cultural Affairs for our Victoria College. Welcome to the Museum of the Coastal Bend and our John W. Stormont Lecture Series. The John W. Stormont Lectures are sponsored by a grant from the Victoria College Foundation and by members of the Museum of the Coastal Bend. If you're not a member of the museum, please consider becoming one. We can help you with that at the museum's front desk. Also, if you're a member of the museum, you get a 20% discount in our museum store and 20% off of books such as Wrangling Pelicans. So tonight, our lecturer is Dr. Tim Seiter, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Texas at Tyler, a specialist in colonial Texas with an emphasis on Spanish and Native histories. Dr. Seiter presents a richly detailed history of daily life for Spanish soldiers and Presidio women at 18th century Presidio La Bahia. Wrangling Pelicans, his newest book, which I previously mentioned is available in the museum store, recreates the complexities of life at the Spanish Empire's edge, where survival mattered more than royal decrees. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tim Seiter.
Well, first off, I want to say that it's always wonderful to come back to the Museum of the Coastal Bend, or just Victoria and the Goliad region generally. I remember coming here a couple years ago to do all the research for my book. I remember years before that coming to learn more about the Colonial peoples. And so every time I ever visit this region, this area, I always am sad to leave, but it's good to be back again. So I wanted to say, to start things off, thank you, Sue, for having me. Also, thank you to Claudia, Ben, for making all this possible. As was mentioned, my name is Tim Seiter. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Tyler. And even though most of today's presentation is going to be focused on Spanish Texas, I'm actually an expert in native peoples of Texas. And this book project came to be because I was doing an article on the Colonial peoples of the Texas Gulf Coast. And in that article, I kept depicting the Presidio soldiers as these villains. Because in this article, in many ways, these Presidio soldiers are going out to hunt down the Colonial peoples. But the best history looks at all different perspectives. And so I wanted to look through the eyes of the Presidio soldiers to learn what is motivating them to do these kind of extermination campaigns that end up not being successful at all. The issue, however, was anytime I tried to find a general history of Presidio soldiers, it was always from the top down. We would learn about captains, governors, the commandant generals. We would never learn about the everyday soldiers and what their life was actually like. So I decided to write an article that would describe the life of an everyday soldier. And then I kept learning new things and then more new things. I fell down to a rabbit hole and I tripped to another one. And then 4 years later, I wrote this book, Wrangling Pelicans. And so what I have planned for us to do today, this is the Wrangling Pelicans, which covers many different topics, as you can see. But our roadmap for today is this. Oops, looks like that list is a little bit messed up. First, we're going to be... we'll talk about why the book is called Wrangling Pelicans, because that is kind of an odd name, but there is a story that relates to it and it's very important. Second, we'll learn about the Native American landscape here in this region and Texas generally. What we're going to find out is that Texas is far more diverse in its indigenous peoples than other folks tend to think. It's a really, really diverse place. And then the third, number one, we're learning what truly life was like for Tejanos in 18th century Texas. I'm going to take us back in time. We're going to kind of be put into their own shoes and see the type of choices they had at their kind of ready. And then fourth, we're going to learn about the Carranco-Spanish War, because at a certain point, the Spanish are going to try to take over Carranco land. And we're going to find out if that goes well for them or if it doesn't really go all that well for them. And then finally, if we have the time for it, we may not, I wanted to make a connection to the American Revolution. As we know, this is America 250, the 250th anniversary of our nation. So I wanted to tie how Spanish Texas is actually connected to the American Revolution, because there are a few connections. In my opinion, they've been kind of overblown to some extent, and you'll see why that is by the end of this presentation. So to start, I wanted to tell a story that involves pelicans. And the story begins in early 1770, because in that year, the monarch of Spain, King Carlos III, he is developing a royal zoo, and he wants to acquire all these fantastic animals living throughout his expansive kingdom. And so he orders high-ranking officials scattered across the globe to send him, in his words, curious pieces. And so dragon-like iguanas came from Mexico. Guanacos, which are a relative of llamas, came from Chile. And the governor of the Philippines outdid everyone. He sent over 3 Asian elephants. And those Asian elephants became the crown jewel of King Carlos's zoo. So 5 years are going to pass, and King Carlos one day is walking through his zoo, and he sees that he has bats, he has doves, macaws, parakeets, parrots, storks, and toucans, but what he doesn't have are pelicans. Yes, there are pelicans back in Spain. Yes, there are many pelicans back in Spain, but he doesn't have American brown pelicans. So he writes a forward letter, and he sends it to the governor of Texas, nearly 5,000 miles away. And he demands that governor to send troops to the Texas coast and acquire some pelicans for his zoo. So I started to research to see what happened, and the sources pretty much tell me the soldiers outright ignored their king, because they realized that most pelicans resided in the territory of the Carranco peoples. And that was a territory that you did not intrude on lightly. They did not want to risk their lives acquiring pelicans for this king 5,000 miles away. So they refused to wrangle pelicans. And that's largely because of what I term as Spain having a paper empire. That on King Carlos's maps over in Spain, he's looking at them, Texas is part of his territory, part of his empire's land. But in reality, it was the native peoples who controlled Texas. Throughout the entirety of the 1700s, native peoples are in control. And there's a really well-known historian, Juliana Barr, who makes this claim in one of her books, Peace Came in the Form of One. She says that native peoples were the feared conquerors in Texas. So to dive into this a bit deeper, I want to give some context and background on all the native peoples living in Texas. The thing is that whenever we think about indigenous groups in Texas, we tend to think about like the Cherokees and the Comanches, the Apaches, and maybe the Coroncos if you live on the Texas Gulf Coast. That makes it seem like there's only a handful of native groups, and if you Google Native American maps of Texas, you'll only see around 8 to 9 groups on that map. But in actuality, there are hundreds of distinct native peoples in Texas. In fact, one historian, William C. Foster, counts upwards of 200 unique native peoples. So there's a lot of diversity here in Texas. And while that diversity is beginning to consolidate by the 18th century, you have a lot of these diverse native groups joining together to better fend off Europeans and other threats elsewhere. It is still a very diverse place. In fact, it's so diverse that some scholars believe Indian Sign Language was developed here as a way of trading and communicating with all these people that spoke different languages. And so that shows how diverse it is. Another good example to show this diversity is these native peoples realized they needed to be able to tell other groups apart. And the way they would do that is through two major things: hairstyles and tattoos. So you can see over on the far left, that's an Takapau person, and he has a kind of more of an afro-looking hairstyle. It's very distinct compared to the Wichita women in the center. Also compared to the Poco Karankulas, who have it's harder to see on the PowerPoint, but they have a long braid in their hair, both man and female. So by looking at hair, you can tell some of the native groups apart. But really the best way of telling native peoples apart is by looking at their tattoos. There's another historian who did a lot of work on the La Belle and La Salle's colony, Robert Weddell, who stated that tattoos for native peoples acted as their passports. And you could, on first glance, identify a particular native person's tribe based on the tattoos they had. And so, let me get this little PowerPoint clicker working. Okay. You can see right here, the Takapau person near the Houston, Galveston area has a black line that starts at the tip of his forehead and goes down to the tip of his nose. The Wichita women, it's harder to see, but they have a string, kind of like a pendant of triangles on their chest that go around their chest. And that was tied to one of their mythical heroes they had. I don't want to go down too deep into that rabbit hole when we have 40 minutes today. But I had actually written a whole article on Native American tattooing in Texas that I'm about to publish. A lot of things I found had never been published before, which is really exciting. And the Cocos, it might be difficult to see as well. Right there, they have circles on their cheekbones. And that was a very distinct tattoo for the Coco peoples. And so you have all these diverse natives, and they have hundreds of settlements across Texas. And while I was able to identify some of those settlements through archaeological means, and you can see some of them on this map, there are likely many more. Some of the archaeological sites on the coast are inaccurate, but those in East Texas are historically located, like indigenous settlements. So Native peoples had many settlements across Texas. The Spanish, by comparison, really only had 3 major settlements. And yes, they had cities and towns like San Saba, Los Adais, and also like Bucareli, but generally these are the 3 main settlements during the Spanish Texas period. We have San Antonio, which has a population at this time of around 2,000 individuals. We have Nacogdoches in East Texas, of around 1,000 people. And La Bahia, which I think everyone here knows where that's at, also had around 1,000 people. So today what I'll be doing is I'm going to be talking about what life would be like if you lived in one of these 3 settlements. Now, life in each settlement was different. Like people in Nacogdoches had much more interaction with the French in Louisiana, but generally everything I say in this presentation will apply to most of these settlements. Okay, so let's say you are transported back in time to the 1700s, and you're in one of those settlements. Well, the first thing you should probably look to do is to get a job, because the Spanish state does not take vagrancy all that lightly. So what jobs do we have available? Well, you could potentially be a farmer. You could help, grow some crops for your community. The issue is that being a farmer is dangerous, and that's largely because if you go out to tend your fields alone, you are likely to be attacked by native peoples after a certain period of time. So very few people are wanting to do this job of going and tending their fields unless they have a big group of people protecting them, or Presidio soldiers there to protect them. And while irrigation canals are effective at places like San Antonio and places like here in the Goliad region and like La Bahia, irrigation canals are just not as effective. They're not able to really make it work as they do in San Antonio. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I go over all those reasons in my book. But that's another reason, or that's another explainer for why most people in Spanish Texas, instead of growing crops en masse, tended to have just self-contained personal gardens where they grew all of their food. All right, so we don't really want to be a farmer. We know that's dangerous. We know that's not going to really work out well for us. What else could we do? Well, potentially we could be a ranch hand for the mission or a private citizen. But that's dangerous too, because native peoples, as I just mentioned, will pick you off if you don't go into with a large group. But the thing is that even when you go with a large group of people, sometimes native groups like the Comanches and the Crompos don't seem to care. There's this one incident where there are, I think it's 15 ranch hands that are going out to tend some cattle, and they get set upon by around 30 Comanches, and 2 of those Spaniards or Tejanos are killed. The rest are able to get away because they just head for the actual Presidio. But the governor, in talking about this incident, says the reason why the native peoples are so unafraid of these ranch hands is because they don't have any weaponry. And the weaponry that they are able to acquire is in really, really bad shape. And so the governor quite literally says that when officers go out with these vecinos, or regular kind of ranch hands, they die because the native peoples are just better armed than they are. All right, so we don't want to be a farmer. We don't want to be a ranch hand. What else could we do? Well, we could potentially be a laborer. So whenever San Antonio needed a set of city council buildings, they hired a group of laborers to help construct those city council buildings. And those laborers worked for 8 days straight. And after 8 days of labor, they were paid a total of 2 pesos, which is the equivalent of around $50 today. So imagine yourself going out working hard labor for 8 days. At the end of that hard labor, you get paid $50. So you can see that being a laborer is also not well paid. The jobs are not consistent. And if the jobs were consistent, I did the math, and let's say you got paid the same rate as you did in building those city council buildings, and you worked every single day for an entire year, you would only earn around 92 pesos, which is the equivalent of around $2,500 today. So that is really, really difficult to live off of. And so you can understand, with all these kind of job opportunities being relatively lackluster, there's not many people that are able to do many jobs and make a lot of money. However, there are some skilled laborers and workmen in the community. For instance, there's some carpenters, there's some blacksmiths, there's even some barber surgeons, but they too are finding themselves on the precipice of impoverishment. And to give you an example, I want to examine a surgeon for the La Bahia company known as Ildefonso Reyes. Now, one day, 2 men got into a fight. One of those men hit the other with a gardening hoe and almost bashed in his skull. And so they called Ildefonso Reyes to come stitch up that person's head. He will get paid 1.5 pesos for his deposition in legal proceedings, another 1.5 pesos for examining the health of the individual who had their head nearly smashed in, and 8 pesos for providing the patient 18 stitches. So all in all, that work pretty much netted him the equivalent of around $300 today, which is much less expensive than a hospital visit today. But even with all that money, Reyes will say in later interviews how he is himself quite impoverished, and the only thing that he has to his name is a jacal, like a small wattle and dove hut, and his doctoring tools. So even these skilled laborers, because no one really has money to spend, no one is buying kind of any type of carpentry items or blacksmithing type gear, they too are facing a lot of struggle. And with consistent work really hard to come by, what ends up happening is that there ends up being a lot of unemployed men in Spanish Texas. And the officials at the time label these men often as vagrants or loiterers. And because these people have nothing to do, sometimes they get drunk and they gamble and play cards, and they end up stealing from their countrymen and their comrades. And that causes a lot of problems. So the city councils of these regions begin to pass a lot of ordinances trying to make sure that people aren't just loitering around and causing trouble. And some of these ordinances have some pretty severe punishments. For example, if you stole something in one of these communities from like one of your neighbors, you can be punished with upwards of 200 lashes, depending on kind of your racial status. Moreover, you could be fined or imprisoned if you walk the streets at night. Now, historians, when they encounter these types of ordinances, which were called bandos back in the day, they can come up with this assumption that Spanish Texas is a really, really strict locale, that these city council members don't mess around, they're gonna lash you 200 times. But you have to dig deeper, because when you dig deeper, you see that most of this is just scare tactics, and that they very, very rarely ever punish anyone for being a vagrant. Now, why is that? Because most of the time, the entire community has no work to do, so they can't punish the entire community. Now, I spent some time looking through the archive, and I could really only find a handful of people that were punished for vagrancy. And these folks were usually always from outside of the community. To give you a story, I want to talk about Francisco Sanchez and his wife, Maria Saldana, because they arrived in Spanish Texas, in San Antonio particularly, in 1744. Now, we're not sure why they came to Texas. This region is viewed by many to be a backwater at the time. Even the governors that come to Texas and rule over the region call it worse than Siberia because it's so isolated. So we're not exactly sure why this couple is coming to Spanish Texas, but as soon as they get here, they begin to do one thing. They begin to gamble with all the residents. And they seem to be really, really good at it, because after a year, they've taken a lot of money from the locals. And these locals have gotten very upset with them. So upset that they begin to imprison Francisco Sanchez, and they begin to spread a rumor, you may have read at the bottom, that he kidnapped his wife. That his wife is not actually truly his wife, but someone that he brought along with him. Now, I really wanted to dig deep into this episode to see what the truth was. And after doing so, I'm pretty confident that these are just rumors. That there's a lot of evidence to show that they actually were married, but the San Antonio residents were getting very upset that they were losing all their money, and they wanted to have leverage over Sanchez. And ultimately, he is going to beg his imprisoners to let him go. And he says that if you let me go, I'll go acquire all the information to show that I did not kidnap this woman. I'll come back, and then I'll show you that information. They agree. He is let go. He never returns. So before moving on a little bit more, I want to talk about also how imprisonment and just prison generally is much less severe than we would ever imagine in this space too. That most of the time these prisons are just guardhouses, and these guardhouses have no doors. That the windows of these guardhouses are wide open. That people that are imprisoned often accost passerbys to go get them alcohol so they can get drunk at night. And the people guarding them are their friends, are their relatives. These are very small and small-knit communities. Everyone knows everyone else. And so let's say you have a friend of yours that's in the jail and you're watching him. Many times these two friends would collude with each other so the prisoner could be set free for a night to spend time with his wife and then come back in the morning. So the jail sentences are really, really loose, much more than you would expect. And to demonstrate that, I want to tell you another story that I have in my book. This time it relates to an individual known as Francisco Guerra. Now, Francisco Guerra, he tries to kill his brother with a horse. And because of that, he is imprisoned. While he is in prison, we don't know how, likely maybe from a passerby through an open window, smuggles a knife into the prison. And using this long, kind of broad knife, is able to get out of his shackles. He goes to another citizen's house. He apparently is having an illicit relationship with that other citizen's wife. They do their thing in the carriage house, and then he comes back. And he would have gotten completely away with it if it wasn't for his wife finding out, complaining to the governor, and then he is put back in jail for another month. He does not like jail. He begins to threaten to kill the governor. They then shackle his feet in addition to his hands. Somehow he acquires another knife. He gets out of his shackles. He goes out to walk the town. The soldiers at the time are so sick of it, they ask one of the other prisoners to go get Guerra. But that prisoner is sleeping, doesn't want to get up. So this demonstrates generally how lax sometimes these imprisonments can be. And most of the time, the imprisonments are really just a means of public shaming. And that's how punishment worked in Spanish Texas and colonial Mexico generally. Public shaming. For example, some of the most effective punishments that I uncovered in my research included forcing criminals or wrongdoers to pull up tree stumps with their bare hands. And so if you ever try to pull up a tree stump with tools, you know how difficult that is. You can see why it's punishment if you're forced to do it with your bare hands. Another punishment that was apparently so effective that it caused people to leave Texas entirely was sweeping the plaza. Because sweeping the plaza, or just sweeping the center square, was viewed as women's work during the time. And so if you got men to do it, it emasculated them. And there are many moments of them fleeing, or there's soldiers that actually desert their posts to go to complain to a superior because they had to sweep the plaza. But one of the most surprising forms of punishments that I uncovered was related to deer skin and bison skin. And I didn't ever expect this, but because these people are dealing with so much skin in their everyday lives, be a deer, bear, bison, they realize how heavy that skin can be. So if you broke the law, one captain and the governor actually made his men lay down, and they would slowly stack these skins on top of that person until that person could no longer breathe. They would nearly suffocate. So they would do that in a public space everyone could see. So while punishments at times could be quite severe, most of the time, it was meant to publicly shame the person that had broken the law. Now, with nothing to do, as we talked about, there's a lot of kind of vagrants or itinerants, as they say, in Spanish Texas. What is there to do? Well, they tended to do things that were fun for them. And those things tended to be like horseshoes or ladder toss, which they called bolas. They also played this marble game called chusas. And cockfighting is well reported in all the historical sources as well, that they technically needed a license from the crown to cockfight and gamble on these cockfights. But because all these crown officials were so far away, they did the same thing when it came to Wrangling Pelicans. They kind of gave them the middle finger and just did it themselves. But the most played game, and I'm kind of kicking myself because I forgot my own card deck, because I actually have an interactive activity I usually do at this time. But their most played games is card games, and they would always gamble on cards. One game they played was called 31. So think of blackjack, but instead of getting to 21, you had to get to 31. But the game that we see that is probably most written about is called chance. And the reason why it's called chance is because it's a pretty straightforward game. And what I usually do at this point, and again, I'm kicking myself, but I usually have a pack of cards and I ask an audience member to play with me. If they beat me in this game, I give them a free copy of my book. I will try to look at my cards and do this later, but with chance, you draw a card and then the dealer draws a card. And then you begin to flip over cards. And let's say I drew a 4 and the dealer drew a 6. Whoever flips over a 4 or a 6 first wins. And so it really is like a flip of the coin. And it was causing a lot of the inhabitants to gamble away all of their materials they needed to survive. And the issue was that the Spanish officials don't want the people to be living in poverty. So they try to outlaw these gambling games. But the people that are meant to enforce these laws, these kind of municipal city councilmen, they are the ones who decide to set up their own casino houses. Because who's going to enforce them? And there are tons and tons of different examples of that. My favorite aspect of all these gambling games, however, is that women seem to be a big part. Women seem to be a very big part of them. That women, when they have nothing to do after they're done making the laborious process of their homemade corn tortillas, they go and they try to set up celebratory events where they'll have cockfights and provide food and liquor for the cockfights. And they'll also be the house, the dealer for these card games. And that was a way of making more money for themselves, because if anyone here has gambled at 21, you know that the house always has an advantage because they act last. And so women would fulfill that role and be dealing a lot of these cards. And women generally in the Spanish-Texas frontier and most places across colonial Mexico and the borderlands have far more rights than you would ever anticipate. In fact, most of the biggest landowners at the end of the 18th century are actually Spanish women, because whenever their husbands pass away, their husband's property comes into their own possession and they can manage that property. And this is kind of a one-off, but I would always see my research too, how governors and captains are very upset at women because they are expecting men to race through the streets on horses, but they don't expect women to be doing the same thing, and women are doing it very, very frequently. All right, so we learned that there's not a lot of jobs in Texas that are well-paying or consistent. But I did purposely leave out one profession, and that profession is of a Presidio soldier. Now, this profession, by all intents and purposes, is the most desirable job you can have in a borderland space across colonial Mexico. But it's also the most dangerous profession you can have in a borderland space across colonial Mexico. So the most dangerous job today is being a logger, kind of cutting down trees, making sure those trees are safely delivered and prepared. And being a logger has a death rate out of 100,000 workers, has a death rate of 100 per 100,000. So out of every 100,000 workers, 100 of those workers die every year. What I wanted to do was extrapolate that out to Presidio soldiers and see what the Presidio soldiers' death rate would be compared to the most dangerous profession today. And after doing the math, out of 100,000 Presidio soldiers, around 10,000 would die every year. So it's an incredibly, incredibly dangerous profession. Why would anyone want to do this? Well, first and foremost, it pays better than pretty much any other job that you can acquire. You get to earn at least 300 pesos a year. Yes, the salary kind of diminishes year after year as the Spanish state gets cheaper and cheaper, but that is the equivalent of $8,000 in today's money a year versus around $2,000 a year what a laborer would earn if they had to work every single day nonstop for an entire year. And the beauty of being a Presidio soldier is that that payment is secure. It is consistent. You sign up for a 10-year stint when you join the Presidio. You are a soldier for 10 years. And that means you get a crown paycheck for 10 years consistently. Another reason why people wanted to be Presidio soldiers is that it increased your status. That you're able to carry weapons into town, and other vecinos are not able to do that. More women are interested in you generally too, because they know you can provide for them. And while you certainly have really prominent women landowners, most of the women in these settlements have to rely on their husbands for all their kind of necessities, their clothing. So having a man that's in the Presidio guarantees that you're going to have clothing if you're a woman, therefore these men become more attractive. And then thirdly, if you join the Presidio, you join the military's legal jurisdiction. And what that means, to put it in the simplest terms, is that if you break the law, you are put on trial by your peers, other soldiers. And those other soldiers tend to be more favorable to your cause. And so that provides you much more legal protection. But I think the biggest perk you acquire when you join the Presidio is that you can be white. Now this sounds odd, but most people living in Texas, if you look at censuses, they're all labeled as being in Espanol, like being Spanish. But in reality, they're all mestizo. They're all mixed or indigenous. They're not truly Spaniards. But if you join the Presidio, the Spanish state on paper will label you as a Spaniard, will label you as white. And being white has a lot of privileges. And this goes all the way back to the Reconquista, from the years 700 to the 1400s, where the Christians on the Iberian Peninsula are trying to reclaim all this land that had been taken by the Mayan Empire. And as this kind of Reconquista is going on, there becomes this thought process that these Christians need to have clean or pure blood. And by that, I mean they cannot have the blood of Africans or Muslims or Jewish people. It has to be Christian white blood. And whenever these colonizers, these Spaniards, try to go over to the New World, they bring this idea of racial purity with them. In fact, they have what is called a system of caste, the casta system, sistema de caste. And on this caste system, they have pretty much written out every single racial mixture and like what you are if you are kind of mixed. So right here, if you're a Spaniard and you marry an indigenous woman, your child is mestizo. If you're mestizo and you marry a Spanish woman, your child's mestizo. They do this for 100 different variations. It's ridiculous. But looking at these casta systems makes it seem as if it's strict. Remember how I was referring to like all these legal ordinances and how those ordinances make it seem like things are so strict? Things don't operate like this in the Spanish-Texas frontier. Things are far more fluid than these types of kind of hierarchies make it seem. And what ends up happening is you have people who, for all intents and purposes, are black, but they're labeled as white by the Spanish state because they join the Presidio, or they become really wealthy, or they're well liked in their community. So it's important to point that out, that while most people are indigenous and mestizo in Texas, they want to acquire the status of being white. And the best example of this comes in a story from San Antonio, in which you have a 31-year-old indigenous person trying to marry a 13-year-old girl. Now, what ends up happening is that the relatives of the 13-year-old girl are incredibly upset. And so they go to the governor's house to complain. They're not complaining because of the age difference. They're complaining because the 13-year-old girl belongs to a family that is in the Presidio. And so they're labeled as white. And they don't want their niece to be marrying an indigenous person, because that would make their blood impure or have it be kind of mixed in a way they don't want. But the great irony of this, let me see if I actually can find the exact quote. Yes, in legal proceedings, because they made this a big hubbub, legal proceedings, we have the governor write this about the family of the 13-year-old girl, that it was, I quote, notorious in public knowledge that the young girl's family were mulattoes on all four sides. So you have people who are viewed as African by their community members, but white by the Spanish state, wanting to protect that whiteness, and that's why they want the 13-year-old girl to marry an indigenous person. So that is the biggest perk, or one of the biggest perks for joining the Presidio, because if you're viewed as white, you can acquire high rank in the military, you can join a commercial guild, you can go to college, you can join the priesthood. It gives you all these things that you wouldn't have otherwise. Okay, so let's say we join as a Presidio soldier. That is the best path. Let's take that path. Well, I want to describe now what your day-to-day life would be like if you were a Presidio soldier. You would start your day, most likely, waking up to the crowing of fighting roosters and the fort's drummer calling all the soldiers to order. And then when the troops are mustering in the center of the fort, you usually have a corporal or a sergeant sometimes a higher ranking officer, look through all the men to make sure all the uniforms are somewhat matching. They are supposed to have matching uniforms, but they either gamble in the way or they get worn out. They want to make sure that they all have all their weaponry nicely prepared, and particularly begin to read the Crown's penal laws. That way these soldiers, if they desert, they know what kind of punishment they're going to get. Again, I find in my book that even though these punishments are very severe, so many men desert, but they come back and are welcomed with open arms because the job is so dangerous. So after the inspections, after the officials read out all the Crown's penal codes, if time permitted, they would do shooting practice. But the issue was that they would tend to run out of bullets and paper cartridges. So there's a historian friend of mine named Gary Pinkerton, and he was looking through the archives, and he discovered that at La Bahia, they were running so short on paper cartridges, they actually tore up pieces of their archive and used that as the paper cartridges. And so quite literally shot it to pieces, which it makes us as historians quite ill. After the shooting practice, soldiers were counted, they were assigned their daily tasks, and these daily tasks could range from collecting taxes for the crown, escorting people as they cut wood, hunted animals, or traveled. Remember, this is native-dominated land, and if you go out into this land, you need to be protected by some soldiers. They also are going to guard missions, because the missions are often being attacked by other native peoples trying to reclaim the people living in the missions, or these mission neophytes want to run away. So you might be protecting the mission, but in order to protect the mission, you have to be viewed as either a married man or having high moral responsibilities, because there was so much kind of sexual abuse and assault at a lot of these missions. The most common task, however, was horse herd duty. So around, I would say, 20 to 30 soldiers were always status, they always were positioned to protect the horses of the entire community. Because while the Spanish believed that stone forts were the most important things in this area, the native peoples thought otherwise, and they focused much more on the horses and wanted to acquire these horses. And so the soldiers are, in many ways, kind of feeling very paranoid, trying to constantly guard these horses. The horses are always stampeding. Like on one week, there's a strong gust of wind and it makes the entire herd jump out of the corral and get scattered into the wilderness. But what they're really worried about the most is defending against native peoples. Because what ends up happening is, because this is native land, these groups, and it really is multiple groups that attack the Spanish, these indigenous groups, they wait until it's nightfall, and they sneak into the corral. They identify which animals are the healthiest and which ones are the weakest. And then to the weak animals, they sometimes cut their legs to make them slower. And then they try to cause a stampede. They wait for the horses to stampede. They choose the best ones. The slower ones are the weakest ones, which will slow down the pursuers because they need to reclaim all the horses. And then they do something that I think is quite clever. Because there's so many different native territories, what they likely do, or they tend to do, is they take the horses they stole to their enemies' lands, to make it seem like their enemies stole the horses. So we see the Comanches do this all the time. They'll come down to San Antonio, steal horses, and they'll go through Apache lands to make it seem like the Apaches stole all these horses. Because horse herd duty is equal parts boring and equal parts like exhilarating at times, there is a lot of paranoia, as I said, but on their downtime, when there is free time, we see a lot of the men and women of the community participate in horse races. And in the archives, we see a lot of their officers always trying to get on to them about stopping these horse races because it's causing a lot of problems. Like they would particularly do what is known as like the watermelon race, where you would have someone with a watermelon in one hand, And they had kind of the finish line a mile down the road, and all of his friends tried to grab the watermelon before he crossed the line. And this is recorded all the way up until the 1900s. They're still doing these same types of horse races. Generally, because the Spanish had very few troops, at every fort you only have around like 100 troops, I would say generally throughout the 18th century. Because there's so few Spanish soldiers, these Presidios usually fought defensively. And by that I mean that you would typically have a group of soldiers that are circling the Presidio, and they're looking for any sign of what they call hostile activity. Now, those signs could be discarded arrowheads, or horse tracks, or unfurling smoke, because like the Carancos would frequently use smoke as a way of communicating across long distances. They would look for buzzards in the sky to see if any native peoples had been hunting and left their dead killed behind, or even thrown out provisions of mezcal from potential raiding parties. And so if a group found a worrisome element, like I just described, they would, instead of pursuing where they think that element came from, would turn tail, go back to the Presidio, get a much larger party, and ride out to meet this unknown threat. And so on one occasion, you have a reconnaissance team that spots a large number of horse tracks. And they they think it is a raiding party, so they report it to their commander, and they rode out to confront the presumed warriors with 31 men. But instead of finding a raiding party, they simply found a peaceful contingent of Apaches returning from a bison hunt. And the reason why I told you that story is because it demonstrates the extreme state of paranoia that these soldiers are under. That any type of activity they see, regardless if it's peaceful, they are thinking worst case scenario. Because again, this is not their land. And to emphasize that, it is important to point out that these soldiers, they really respected the indigenous people in this area in terms of their military prowess. In fact, one angry commander here at La Bahia said this, that his soldiers suffered the misapprehension that they can't even kill an Indian. And what ends up happening is that the people, these Tejanos living on this land, they're not dumb. They realize they're in native territory, and they realize that native military tactics are quite effective. So they begin to adopt those tactics for themselves. They begin to shed their equipment. They begin to have much lighter equipment. They begin to fight in kind of guerrilla warfare styles. They fight more like native peoples. And by the end of the 18th century, you'll have observers that say the following, that Presidio soldiers can face exposure to the elements for 50 days or more, and it does not bother them. They live on horseback day and night and travel with such determination that it is amazing to see the territory they can traverse in a very short time. Regardless of how much they adopted and adapted to native warfare tactics and techniques, Presidio soldiers, as already mentioned, died in great numbers. And whenever someone died out in native land, what usually became of their body was that it was often desecrated or mutilated by native peoples. And that is because a lot of these native peoples viewed these Spaniards as intruders. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I'm a native historian. I can go really deep into that. But generally, when death occurs, the body is mutilated, but you'll have a group of soldiers go out and try to reclaim it. They'll bring the body back to the town, they'll try to clean it up, they'll put a robe or Franciscan habit on the body, and that's because clothes are very valuable during this time period. Whenever native peoples attack someone out in the field, they tend to strip them naked and take all of their clothes. And so if you have a deceased person, you bring them back to the community, you put a Franciscan habit, and then you take them to the local church. And at that church, like say the Alamo, you dig up the ground of the Alamo and you bury them right underneath the church. That way they're part of that community's community of the dead. And that is how burials were done for over 100 years. They'd be buried literally under the church The church that we see at La Bahia, the church that we see, and all the missions we see in San Antonio, they are, in many ways, cemeteries. While some soldiers are put to rest for a very long time, other soldiers only have a temporary reprieve. When they're done with their horse herd duty or done with all their daily duties, they often retire to their jacal, or they retire to the actual Presidio itself and sleep there for the day. But they're, again, always on the clock, and if there is more signs of enemy activity, they might be roused up and have to go and see what that might be. Now, it looks like I'm running low on time, so I'm going to go through these next slides pretty quickly so I can be respectful to your time as well. Next, I was going to talk about the Franco-Spanish War. To summarize everything, the Spanish get really sick of being kind of the inferior group in the Spanish Texas area. So they decided to wage a war against the Carranco people, and they want to exterminate them outright. And they have a whole kind of genocidal plan where they outline all their ideas. Ultimately, things do not work out well for them. The inhabitants of La Bahia are afraid to even go get water, which is like 100 yards away, because they think the Carrancos are there lying in wait for them. You have in San Antonio an uptick in Comanche attacks, and so the city council are saying that there's not even a candle to light one's way, and that the settlement itself might be completely destroyed. And ultimately, on the trail, on the pathway from San Antonio to La Bahia, there are so many deaths from Native American attacks that crosses, memorial crosses, line the entire pathway. And the Commandant General heard about that, and he heard that travelers were being so afraid by all these different crosses that he demanded they take all those memorials down. So to summarize things, it did not go all that well for the Spanish. And ultimately, a new mission is going to be built for the Carrancos, but it acts mostly as a place to pay out protection payments rather than convert Carranco people. And then finally, I want to get to the American Revolution connection. So Texas does contribute to the American Revolution. It does so through two different means: cattle and donations. I should say involuntary donations. So the cattle, we all know how, in many ways, Texas is the birthplace for the cattle industry across the nation. And there are tons and tons of cattle in Texas. Well, Bernardo de Galvez, who is trying to campaign across the Gulf Coast, needs meat to feed his army. And so he gathers tons of cattle from Louisiana near New Orleans to, again, feed his army. But that causes a problem because he's taken all this cattle. He needs more cattle to replenish what he has taken. So he demands over 10,000 cattle from Texas. And if you Google that, how many cattle did Texas provide Galvez, you'll get that number, 10,000. But it's not accurate. We've only been able to identify around 2,000 cattle that actually made it to Louisiana. And that is because this is native-dominated land. People are literally afraid to do this. In fact, one person says, it's that actual quote, the governor, when talking about the cattle, says that all the people in this province are so intimidated that I do not think I will be able to find anyone who, for any amount of money, whatever, would expose himself to the dangers. So yes, thousands of cattle were brought over to Louisiana, but not as much as people say they were brought over. And they were never used with Bernardo de Galvez's army. They were used to resupply the herd at New Orleans. The second kind of contribution is known as donativos, which are these donations given to the American war effort, because the Spanish are very much on board with the British having a humiliating loss and losing all their colonies. But the thing is that while some people make it seem like these Tejanos are donating all this money out of the goodness of their heart, there are people actually donating this voluntarily. That all this money, and there's like around 2,000 pesos that comes out of Texas, is taken from the soldier's paycheck without their approval. So those are the two contributions to the American Revolution. They've been overstated, but there are certainly still contributions, and Texas plays a role in the success of the American Revolution. Okay, that's all I have for today. Thank you all so much, and I would love to answer any questions.
When was the
1779 to 1786, I believe, 1789 actually. So think about the American Revolution, same time period, but goes on a little bit longer. And that's one of the reasons why it was so hard to get cattle to New Orleans, because they were kind of fighting a war at the time as well. It's a great question.
So they never shipped any pelicans over to Spain?
Not to my knowledge, but there is a fantastic article by Bradley Folsom who details a shipment of bison that go from Texas all the way to Spain. And the people that do so are rewarded greatly for it, but it is a whole ordeal.
Can you talk a little bit about what type of sources you're looking at? How are you finding all this information? It's fascinating, just where do you have to piece all this stuff together?
I am so happy you asked this, because I totally forgot to bring this up. I acquired most of all these sources from the Bear Archives, and also archives in Mexico City, and also in Spain itself, the AGI and the AGN. But those archives are the bureaucratic documents of the kind of governor of Texas and the captains of Texas. The thing you can do, however, if you read a lot of them, is you kind of turn them on their head, and looking at like legal documents, you can see what the everyday people, these societies are actually doing. But this is why I was so happy you brought this up. I have made every single source, every primary source I use for this book, publicly available and searchable through readable PDFs. All you'll have to do is type in texasdocuments.com, go to what is called the Spanish Texas Starter Pack, and I have like 5 gigabytes worth of material for you to look through. And I provide instructions on how to search through it all as well. So I wanted to make sure these sources are as available as possible.
If there were 1,000 people around La Bahia, how many Carancas were around?
Good question. I can't say the exact number, but I believe in the 18 and 1700s, we think it's around 1,000 to potentially 2,000, maybe 3,000. Their numbers at their peak are viewed to be around 8,000, but at this point, while they are still kind of thriving as a community in the culture, their population is kind of being decimated. But they're still able to, in many ways, fend off all these intrusions. They're very powerful people.
Yeah, I'd always understood that they were a little bit taller than normal indigenous people. But also, I read, this was from diaries, I think, for some of the soldiers at the time, that they were cannibal.
Okay, so interestingly enough, one of my major kind of focuses on the Karankawa peoples. And so you're right, the Karankawas actually, we found some evidence that they tended to be a little bit taller than most people at that time period. The heights that you've likely heard of, them being like 6, 7, 8 feet tall, inaccurate. It's very easy to debunk that. And there's been a lot of archaeological studies, Tamara Walter, Jim Rusev, that have actually uncovered some of these remains, and they're actually estimated to average out around like 5'6". But consider the average height of a European at the same time, 5'2" to 5'4". So the Karankawas looked like giants, but they were just tall because they lived a very healthy lifestyle. They had way more diverse foods, and the Europeans will literally die of scurvy, and the Karankawas will be thriving, getting taller and taller. In terms of the cannibalism stuff, it gets really complicated. To simplify it as best as I possibly can, Native peoples across Texas did practice a ritualistic cannibalism. I think there's enough evidence to show that is the case. Europeans at the same exact time are also practicing their own form of ritualistic cannibalism that's on a much greater scale. It's known as mummy. And mummy is like, let's say you have a headache, you go to the local apothecary, they'll ground up some human skulls and you'll drink that. Let's say you have a bruise on your arm, you'll go to the apothecary, they'll give you some human fat and ingest that, supposed to help out with your bruise. So all these societies are cannibalistic in some way. The difference is that the Europeans used the native people's cannibalism as justification for taking all of their land. And we see a lot of their accounts are completely made up. And that Native American cannibalism in Texas was really, really limited and only on quote-unquote ancient enemies. They actually explicitly say, the Karankawas do, they would never eat a European because they don't understand what the practice meant. That's like my down and dirty explanation of it. Hopefully that answers what I need. Well, thank y'all so much. I really appreciate y'all.